decided not to. All right, Michelle and Michelle.
Yes.
Clicker.
Where are you sitting?
Next.
Perfect. So I can keep my eye on you.
You have the agenda. Does anyone need another copy? I sent it out. Nobody needs it? Okay. I'll keep all these extras.
I'll take an extra one.
I was gonna say, if you've got hard copies,
Mine's
send
I
me.
do.
Mine's online, I'll take a hard copy. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenda.
Michelle, do you need one? Oh, sure.
We have it up too.
All right, Michelle, welcome. Are you first?
Oh, yeah, I guess I am. Sorry.
Do you want the clicker? I can click for you.
You can do the welcome. Say the
Okay.
welcome.
Sure. So, we are going to continue our discussions. I get a lot of this we started at the main business meeting and continuation from last time. But a lot of our aim for this meeting is to not only talk about the operationalizing an assessment for 14-15 and the general RFI process from here, but some of the big ideas or policy questions that remain before we could draft the RFP. But as a preliminary matter, not the last subcommittee meeting, but the one before that, there were questions about how we determine item types. I say we, but Michelle's office determines item types for the assessment. So.
Thank you. So you have, well, do they have a copy of this PowerPoint? No. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. Yes, I didn't go to bed till 3 in the morning. Okay,
Oh,
moving right along.
They don't have a copy of this?
We can provide it electronically,
Yeah.
but
Oh.
we've been continuing to work,
For
especially
sure.
given the changes that have happened in the last 48 hours. To be honest, we were on the phone after midnight last night working on this, so we apologize to not have paper copies. But it's posted and we can electronically provide a copy.
And we want to walk you through it, so let me go ahead and get started. This is a topic that I think actually Mr. Alpert had asked about, like what's best practice with regard to the percent of item types on a particular test form. And so I would just want to spend a little bit of time on that and then kind of roll that into what we're currently doing. So really, and maybe you're aware of some of this, so I apologize if it's maybe information that you're already familiar with, but not every state uses open-ended items. And you might remember us talking about this at the beginning of this series of subcommittee meetings where I explained that in 1995, Indiana actually added the plus to ISTEP Plus, and those are the open-ended items that we have. And so those include actually the writing prompt and any open-ended or what we sometimes call constructed response and extended response items. It's interesting because as I was working on this particular slide this morning, in the wee hours of the morning, you know, one of the things I wanted to show you for comparison was the fall test to the spring. So for example, in fall of '08 and previous, about 40% of our test was the open-ended, or what we call in Indiana applied skills. And do any of you remember basic skills? That's what we used to call, okay. So that's what we used to call the other items, gridded response and multiple choice. Now we just typically call it multiple choice. But back then, that's when we also had our old traditional GQE, and it was made up of applied skills and basic skills. So the difference there, to explain the spring and then to talk to you about how that happens. So our spring test currently is about 30-70. So 30% of the items are applied skills, and those are given, as you well know, in March. And about 70% of them are multiple choice or gridded response, which occur in May. And on the next slide, it talks more about some of the kinds of things that actually educators across the state right now are working with the department staff. My staff are heavily involved in actually working through this process. And this process I'm about to describe is actually what determines the percent of items on your test that are a particular item type. So in a nutshell, there is no best practice because it is all dependent upon your content and really what instruction around that content looks like, and trying to mirror the test as best we can to what instructional practice looks like in the classroom. So for example, you might remember we've talked already in this group about depth of knowledge, which is similar to Bloom's taxonomy. But one of the first things we do when we look at these standards that we've actually been doing in the last few weeks with educators across the state is identifying, is this a level 1, 2, 3, or 4? And it could possibly be that maybe it is a 1 and a 2, that this is a concept that actually could be perhaps somewhat easy and maybe moderately difficult. So there's not necessarily one assignment of a number. The priority is really important because what the next one does is it determines how important is that knowledge or skill to the student moving forward, being able to successfully enter the next grade or the next course. And so therefore, it actually receives more importance on the test because it's a skill that we want to make sure it's a higher priority, so it's actually going to get more attention on the test. The appropriate item format, this is when educators are actually telling us, based on how they teach the content, no, I'm still in the same one. Thank you. I will. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. You were fine. Yeah, thanks. Thank you,
You all
Hannah.
should be sitting over here.
Yeah,
So they could see.
yeah.
I don't know. Do
No.
you guys want to
Do you want to
move
move over
or
here where you can see it?
can you see?
I'm all right, 'cause I'm.
Okay.
Okay. Most of what we're going to do is dialogue. This is kind of background information to make sure we caught up from when I was in Minneapolis and you were in Indianapolis. So the appropriate item format, there can be more than one, but this is really the combination of the depth of knowledge, the priority of the particular standard, and the item type actually start formulating the blueprint and actually the form development to help us know the majority of the items that we're actually identifying are going to be TE, or they're going to be, maybe a third of the standards that we think are high priority actually seem appropriate to be a constructed response or extended response. So the blueprint's actually determined based on this combination of these 4 things that we're looking at. The specifications, we went over that already before, so I won't go into great detail. But the most important thing, again, is that we really tie all the decisions that we're making right now with educators as we build the new assessment to the content and to what classroom practice should look like with regard to how students should actually interact with that content. So that, again, the test mirrors as much as possible what instructional practices look like. The next slide is actually operationalizing the College and Career Ready assessment. And this is where we start to now talk about some things that we discussed in the previous meeting with the entire board. And so some of this is a little bit of a review that our waiver does require a College and Career Ready aligned assessment, that we want to have some exposure to items for students. And so one of the things, again, back to kind of BJ's idea about what if we take the concept of CoreLink, make it open access for parents, teachers, students, community members, make it College and Career Ready content, but more importantly, have that technology-enhanced item types. So that's something that we're actually working on right now, and I'm talking with Michelle McCowan about like what's the best timing for that, and maybe sooner is better than later so that teachers can actually start getting more information about how students are performing. So we want to pick your brains about that. And I don't know if you want to talk about the recommendation that you made on this particular slide.
Sure. So as I mentioned in the last meeting, the recommendation from me as council, just in terms of an opportunity to learn standpoint, would be to mandate that an opportunity for exposure is administered by all schools. Now, when I say mandate, it's just synonymous with require. It doesn't mean that it would have to be what enforcement would look like. It would just be a very clear expectation that all districts and schools required to participate in state accountability would administer this opportunity for exposure. That opportunity for exposure needs to be a representative sample, and we need to make sure that they're able to get student level results. So that way, again, students and teachers and administrators would all have meaningful information about how students are performing with the new item types. I don't think that we can overemphasize that what a
True.
different experience this is going to be
That's
for
very true.
students. Even with, again, it's less about access to content and more about displaying content mastery in a different way. So,
And
for-
because,
yeah.
oh, I'm sorry. Let me cut you
I was
off.
just going to give an example. I
Go
mean,
ahead.
and maybe you all can let us know if you're familiar with what the new item types would be. I don't know how much information has already been provided or rolled out. I've been sort of watching this for a few years now. So, just example. Right now we have the open, a writing prompt, open-ended. Say it's tell me about your summer, right? And then that would be looked at in terms of, is there a topic sentence and having the appropriate structural components? Whereas as we move forward into college and career ready assessments, you would perhaps watch a short video and then be expected to be able to use evidence, cite evidence for statements that you make. So the rigor behind the new item types is increased, and that's why even if we've been writing forever, but the way that we display mastery of that's going to be significantly different. Is that fair?
Yes, I would say so. And I think, Michelle and I were talking during break about how, the representative sample, I think, isn't students, it's actually items, just to be clear, and that, that might be something that they would score locally. I mean, we wouldn't produce reports for that. I mean, we could prepare those items and
And they
have
would
that
have
as
the
an
answers.
experience, and we would have an answer key. But what I'd like to do now is walk you through, I'd like to take you back to the handout that Superintendent Ritz walked you through, the different parts, and on page 2 at the top, there's the activities. And I want to walk you through the timeline we have of developing the assessment so that you'll know actually what we're doing right now, and that I want to be sure that you have a chance to ask any questions today about the timeline or the process or what the steps look like. We are actually recruiting right now educators to work this summer. And so we have a survey that's collecting a variety of data on their background and experience and the attributes that we really need for each of our committees. And I'm excited to say, I have to.
Can I ask
Sure.
real quick? I know the presentation during the board meeting talked about, some possible changes. How does it affect the selection of vendors and that process? Is it going to change with that?
No, I'll let Michelle address that. Go ahead.
Sure. So not for 14-15. I mean, for 14-15, we already had, let me rewind and I'll let one Al correct me if I describe this incorrectly, but prior to last week, the plan that was, last week the plan that was communicated to USDOE and the plan that was on the ground from IDOE was that we would administer ISTEP Plus, traditional ISTEP, and in addition to that, the Indiana College and Career Transition Assessment. ISTEP Plus was going to be used for accountability, and the transition assessment was going to be for exposure purposes only. USDOE indicated that that was not compliant with the commitments of the waiver to have the new item types, the college and career ready assessment, and also the having accountability aligned to the new standards. Because of that call, we're talking about using, because it's all being created by CTV at this point, right? So the TA, the transition assessment, as the ISTEP, and that would be the assessment for 14-15, still with CTB. And what the additional conversation around is this exposure opportunity, which we've already been having some preliminary conversations about what that would look like and when it would occur. But given that we're going to operationalize the transition assessment in the spring of 14-15, I think that as council, my recommendation is to make sure that that happens as early in the school year as possible, sort of in the mindset of if we had stuck with the original May window that was proposed last December for piloting or providing exposure, if you do it in August, in terms of opportunity for access, it's not as appreciably different. So if that's helpful, so we'll be sticking with the same vendor for 14, 15, and the RFI and RFP process that we're doing now will continue to run parallel with that.
And so, Michelle, to follow up on that, we have in here a word, what is it, what did you call it?
Interoperability.
So will you talk about what that
So,
is and
sure.
how that doesn't, and how that's okay when we change vendors with our question development that we're doing?
So, I'm trying to think where that is to tell.
Oh, it's on the
Is
first
it on
page.
the first page? There we go.
It's on the third bullet.
So, one of the things it's not a pilot assessment anymore, so I need to change this actually. Glad it says draft. Not only do we need items that align to our Indiana academic standards, our new ones, but also we need items that actually can be used on any vendor's platform. And that's what's known as the interoperability requirements, and that is a requirement across the industry. With next generation assessments, all items that are created by any vendor have to be able to be utilized by any other vendor, so that you can lease items from any vendor and select a different vendor if you want to deliver the assessment. Troy, did we answer your question? Okay. So what I wanted to do was walk through this timeline at the top of page 2. I also was starting to mention that last Friday we actually released a survey to recruit teachers for the summer, because the summer is upon us, and we wanted to see if there was interest, because we want to form actually 4 committees. We need to add some science and social studies items to our pool, and so those teachers will be coming the 3rd week of July. And the 1st week of August, we're going to be looking at items. Those teachers will be coming for ELA and math. And as of Monday morning, and we released this, I probably sent it out, I think, Friday afternoon or early evening. But by noon Monday, we had 400 teachers already respond.
Wow.
So I'm really thrilled about that. So we're excited about the response. So you might.
Does that indicate that teachers are going to make the effort to make this work?
I think that's a resounding yes.
Okay.
That's the largest response we've ever had.
I want to make sure that that is reiterated over and over again.
Absolutely.
Because I think that the people that are involved are really invested in this and are really
Yes.
willing to make the effort to work
Yes,
at
they
it.
are. And I think, Carrie, if I could call upon you as someone who's worked on committees before, it's such a great professional development experience and very rewarding. But that's what I would say. But what do you think?
And we talked about it because I said I had forwarded it to some colleagues and said, you should apply because.
You're responsible for some of those 400.
Because it is a great experience, and I said, and then at lunch you sit down with teachers from across the state, and so there's a lot more going on than just even looking at the tests.
Right. Great networking opportunities, that's for sure. And lots of ownership, I think, to your point, Troy. So we did actually get started a few weeks ago utilizing educators across the state. And you might remember me talking about the fact that we started with making sure that we were using teachers and other educators who had been very familiar with our new standards. So the core group that we started with actually had worked on our Indiana academic standards, our new ones, and we want to make sure they were very steeped in those new standards. And so they've been helping us with our specifications and actually assigning depth of knowledge to each standard and helping us determine the type of item that's appropriate for each of those standards, so that we can actually develop a blueprint. And right now, as we speak, probably, yes, actually, until I think 4:30 or 5, this week we're doing passage review. So the passages are very different. Lots of text complexity that we've been talking about that. I know Amy Horton talked about it today again with regard to resources. And so we're really, again, trying to align the test to make sure that we're matching our new standards and matching those expectations. And so CTB professional item writers will actually develop those items in June and July. And then the 1st week of August, we will review those for alignment to our new standards, appropriateness for the grade level, looking very carefully at content in terms of any bias issues or sensitivity. And then we'll actually be building those forms in the fall, selecting the items, and then putting them on that operational test that will start in March. And as Michelle indicated, really even the open-ended items will be very different. lots of narrative writing we've done before, write a letter to the editor of your school newspaper. Now we're actually looking for evidence-based responses from students, mostly tied to one or more pieces, like a passage, for example. Go ahead, Carrie.
And I have the question of, so the open-ended responses, they're typing the answers, is that correct?
Or using paper pencil.
And then are those still graded by educators? Are those graded online? Like,
No,
there are now.
Artificial intelligence?
Right,
No,
they
these
will
are
grade,
actually hand
And
scored.
so we're still
Yes.
hand scoring things.
Right. Yep, good question. So we will deliver the test in 2 waves, just like we have always, where we have those open-ended items in March, and then we have the other item types, which will now include many TE items. We can still use gridded response. We can still have multiple choice. Very enhanced, multiple correct. You might remember we've actually looked in this group. I think I even showed the full board some of those sample items. So I wanted to share the timeline with you so you would kind of not only be familiar with the development process, but especially in serving on this committee, if you have questions, if you want me to go into more detail, or if you want to think about it and you have questions next month, that's fine too. We will actually set cut scores on those in the summer. And so we always set cut scores after the first administration of a test. And so that's what we'll be doing with this one as well.
So we won't get results until a little later then?
Right, the first time we give a new test,
Always.
you're right about that.
Okay.
Yep. I think it's back to you to talk about the concerns.
Sure, and I think that we've talked about these already. This
Yeah, I
was
think so.
created in advance of our some conversation during the business meeting that ended up being relatively comprehensive about some of these matters related to operationalizing for 14-15. But to reiterate, just largely that we don't have, we have not had sign off from USDOE on anything except that we need to operationalize for 14-15. And then, you know, that it's largely up to us to make sure that the appropriate pieces are in place. And that's, again, why I'm emphasizing, all right, we're operationalizing, let's make sure that we provide the exposure opportunity.
And we have great opportunities for professional development, I think, because teachers are going to be hungry for information about new item types and how does this content really look in my classroom. And so we obviously have a lot of resource materials we've already been talking about. And now I'm going to go back and talk with my staff. I haven't mentioned to them even about this. We wanted to talk to the board first. But I want to go back and talk with them because I know we'll have many things we're going to want to do to give support to teachers as they roll out the new standards and start looking at classroom assessment. What does that look like? How should that be different moving forward?
On your writing, is the rubric going to be similar what we already have in place as far as
That's
grading?
a great question. So we're actually out evaluating all of our current rubrics. So that's one of the things that we're asking educators to help us do when they come to the meetings now, as well as when they come to item review. Look at these rubrics, do they still make sense? And my staff have actually recommended some changes to them to align to the
And we
new
would want to get those out right
expectations.
away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that would be.
Yeah.
So we
Most
expect to push
definitely.
those out,
Most
you know,
definitely.
right when school starts.
Mhm.
We actually have them in draft form now.
In fact, if, I don't know, would those be done by the time we get ready to go to the roundtable? Because that's another resource.
I think we want to make sure that when teachers come and they look at the items, they have the
Okay.
rubric with them, and they may want to make tweaks to that.
Okay.
So I think at the, you know, do you mean next week? Roundtable next week?
Yeah, I didn't know how
We
far
can
you were in
talk
the
about it, but
process.
and we can maybe give some examples, but we want to have educators actually weigh in on
Yeah, see,
finalizing
you
those.
know, and Brad, this goes back to some of your comments, you know, we're creating things as we're doing alignment with
Right.
things. And
Well,
so,
We're building the plane in flight, but
Right.
we have a great flight plan. How's that?
okay,
My attempt
okay.
at humor.
I would definitely think even a rough draft at that
Mhm.
point would be very appropriate.
And I think even
To bring
talking
to the
about the
Yeah.
kinds of
roundtable.
changes that will need to be made.
Because I think the more that you provide
Yeah.
them and
Right.
say that it is in the process of evaluation,
Mhm.
they're gonna have that information in place.
Okay.
Will do. Great idea.
And I guess one thing that we had not highlighted that is on the slide, but just the emphasis on behalf of both staffs, that as we know, our school faculty spend summers preparing for the next school year, and we want to overemphasize the need to start planning for the new item types even this summer, and that to the extent that we can roll out information as soon as possible and provide early exposure to the teachers and administrators, that's our recommendation. So the next agenda item is just the RFI process itself. As you know, the responses are due on the 6th, which is Friday, and they are
3 p.m.
at 3 p.m. and they are slated to present on the 12th, which is 6 days later. So if it pleases the subcommittee, our recommendation is to let the two of us spend our weekend pouring through those and make selections of 5 to 6 vendors. And obviously this is up to the subcommittee's pleasure. And we also provide a recommended format on how we think that the presentations could go. So 30-minute presentations, 20 minutes for questions, and then 10-minute breaks would be built in.
Can we talk about dates just for quick, around, give me those dates again, so it's gonna be.
It's only one day, June 12th.
Yeah, June 12th.
Yeah.
Okay, and then do we know yet when the date will be for their presentations to?
June 12th.
Right, so we
Sorry.
received
That's okay.
RFI responses on Friday, June 6th
Yeah.
at 3 p.m. And the vendors will present on the 12th, starting at 9 a.m. So that's why we're talking about it's a very short turnaround. It is our expectation that vendors who have provided responses to the RFI have preliminarily made themselves available on the 12th. But we want to expedite giving them notice if they've been selected to present on that day.
June 12th is the date that we actually discussed, I think, in early April, to try to get it on your calendar.
Yeah.
You might remember we were
It's at
going
the
to do that in
11th, 12th. We've gone back
Right,
and forth.
and there's a
so
roundtable meeting on the 11th,
11th.
so we had to use the 12th.
That's fine. It's just trying to-
I would just
Okay.
be interested, if you pare it down, how many are eliminated and who they are, and perhaps even like a brief excerpt of why possibly they were eliminated from, you know, if it's because they couldn't provide something that we wanted, or, you know, I would just, you know, if you eliminate 5, I'd be nice to have a couple of
Right, we'll certainly have some
sentences why.
criteria, and we can share that
Yeah,
with you.
That would be, I
And
would,
we're going to share with you all of the responses, because we want you to be familiar with what all of the vendors have to offer to help us inform our RFP. But we only have time to hear probably 6. We're going to meet from 9 to 4 on that day.
Yeah, so.
So are those, so when you do the RFP process, who does that go out to?
So that will be, so the RFI is more informal than the RFP, obviously. So again, it will be posted by IDOA. But there will, if you're asking about the review process and what that would look like, that will have more individuals
formal,
involved. It's very formal. You have a defined rubric on the outset. You will have educators involved. But for the RFI, it's less formal. And again, we have this very tight window in which we need to review all of them, which basically gives us the weekend to go through all of them. But we will provide everyone copies of all of the responses, and we can even, I don't know how many pages of responses we're going to have yet, but we would be happy, to the extent practicable, provide a summary of the responses and a list of who included.
And if we can't do that, at least describing who's not coming and, you know, why we actually selected who we did, for sure.
So, does that process, is that amenable to everyone?
Well, I like that we're proposing, 50 minutes total for really to talk with them. So I think that's good. So they have their presentation, and then we have plenty of time to ask questions, and I think that's the most important piece. We certainly can't listen to, we should narrow it down
Right.
in some way. So I'm fine with that. Any other comments from the committee? Okay.
So the next step is thinking about what what June 12th is going to look like with the question and answer segment. And what we are proposing is now to have a conversation around value statements and information that the subcommittee hopes to garner from those presentations. And we would be happy to then draft some questions that we think will result in getting answers that provide the right information. So basically just making sure that we include the appropriate terminology to make sure we get at the heart of the question. And we just provided some example value statements. If we hear it from you, then we will try to make sure that we have some questions that hit to that, and we would provide those to all of you. And then during at the question and answer section of the vendor presentation day, you would just go through and ask the questions that you feel fit that particular presentation.
So what's the process for getting questions to you, or should we meet earlier than the actual presentation so that we can review those? I would feel like we should have it more formalized, so we ask them the same questions of all the vendors to get clear answers on what they are. So how do we come to agreement on that, or is that something?
Well, that's what we were thinking is we would use today for. To
Okay.
the extent that we could,
No
is talk
problem.
about those sorts of value statements and then allow us to then formulate just questions, perhaps
based on
additional questions, or to represent those concerns or values.
Okay.
So, I mean, we put
And we
some
can
examples.
come back to it
but-
because I think when we go over our big ideas, that's gonna generate, I think, some things you're gonna say,
Okay.
oh, we need to ask about that.
Okay.
Could I suggest an alternative to your plan
Sure.
in the interest of time? Because I'm the kind of person I like to think before I ask the questions and to sit here and try and brainstorm them. Is there any way we could just all submit questions to you and then you could like find the ones that are the same and like
Oh,
consolidate it
absolutely.
into one list and send it to everybody?
But who do we submit them to? That would be my.
Maybe just send them
Is it,
to 2L.
To
2L
Michelle.
Michelle.
without getting in trouble, can we send it to,
One person
or
and then you can
rather
compile.
than even send it to the group so that I see what you've already put as your questions, or I can say, I really agree with question number 3. That's what I'm asking, open door, is that?
Yeah, so
Not
one of
allowed.
the reasons that I just,
Oh, do you want
to
it to be
send
me?
it, just send to
Oh.
one or both of us,
Okay.
is that we would want to
And then you
avoid
can look
anything
for
that looks like
commonalities and
an
things
online
like that.
conversation.
Ah.
So, and you could send it to us and CC other individuals, but I wouldn't want folks to weigh in and say, I really like that question, please make sure you include.
How about we also send out to you the typed up, remember we did some values work at the very first meeting where we actually made some statements like that? So why don't we send that out to you from all of us? Because we made a composite list of that. And that might help.
When do you want those by?
So, we are going to receive the RFI responses Friday at 3. So I would say Monday at noon.
All
It-
right.
Does that sound doable?
Sure.
I'm just making sure I have it. Thank you.
So,
And when we,
And
s-
I-
when we
I
send
think-
out the value statements, then we'll remind
Yes.
us of that.
And I think when we think about the purpose is to gather information so that we really understand what assessments are out there and what the capabilities are of next generation assessments, so that we can actually craft what we're looking for the future in our RFP. These questions, I think, are different from the ones that we would likely ask during an RFP proposal review. But we don't want you to feel limited right now, so I guess we don't want to tell you what the questions should be. We'd like to know, what do you want to ask, and then we can supplement that with additional ideas, and then we could send that out maybe by Tuesday morning and see if you want to add to it. Would that work?
right, and I think that that's getting to what Superintendent Ritz had started to suggest. And because of open door law concerns, there might be conversation is, do we try to meet, say, at 7:30 on the 12th or
Or
8 to have a very quick conversation of
8
items that
o'clock.
would be crossed off of that list or added to that list? Because I don't know how else to do that unless you just rely upon the staff, but then there's not as much review, and I worry about the open door law challenges. So I don't think it would take a tremendous amount of time. I would think even 8 o'clock in the morning, if it starts at 9, that we
Does that sound doable to
convene.
everybody? Meet at 8 And we'll just review the questions and make sure that they're way we want them? Okay.
And we actually have, I think we're meeting next door in room A.
And you'll have
Um,
sent those out to us in advance, so
we
we can
will.
already have looked
We
at them.
will.
I think that'll
So we
expedite
can kind of
things.
have not a debrief, is there such a word as a pre-brief? We could have
A pre-brief.
A pre-brief.
So,
No, you're having a staffing.
That's all staff. Okay, we'll have a staff meeting.
so just to clarify, we will send we will receive
staff
your, value statements or questions, whatever you send to us, and then we will send our recommended list to you all. And when we send that to the group, rather than someone replying all to the group and saying, please add this or please take that off, that conversation is going to happen at 8 a.m. On the 12th. Does that make?
Sure.
So that's why.
And I think you could remind maybe
Yeah.
everyone in the email.
I'll put it in the email as well, but that's just after we send that, if there's a knee-jerk reaction to want to weigh into all, please jot it down and bring it to the morning of the 8th. As Michelle said, we think that we'll probably start to get the juices, generate some ideas about the value statements and sort of information as we go through the big ideas. And again, these are things that we need information about before we draft the RFP. One more piece of this is that we had a joint staff meeting between DOE staff and state board staff last week, the week before. And one of the things that was recommended is to do a survey to get information about what our school faculty think of with assessments. Find out what they're using, what their preferences are. And Michelle and Molly and I have been working on trying to finalize a short survey that would also provide useful information. And we're hoping, I had put the end of week, that might be a little bit optimistic, but we are hoping to have that finalized at least next week. That could then be sent out to the field, and then by the next time that the subcommittee meets, we could share with you what the responses are and put it obviously in an Excel sheet for you to have some useful information around.
And that may also help inform the RFP, I think.
Process. So on the assessment.
I would also suggest to those who you involve in the actual assessment development that they could take that quick survey while they're even showing up and working on things, because that would be another group of people that
It
you'd
would
make
be.
sure you got
Mhm.
information.
It'd be a wide range.
Yeah, it would be. Be a good sample.
Mhm.
So when we talk about big ideas or policy decisions, and we touched on this at the end of the last subcommittee meeting, as we were ending, I think I suddenly said, well, we still have a lot of decisions that we need to make before we draft the RFP. So we're hoping to have some of that here. This is sort of a table of contents, if you will, for the kind of policy decisions that we need clarity around before we draft the RFP. And we'll just go through them one by one. So,
And we might, excuse me for interrupting, we might try to plant some seeds for you today. We don't have to know the answers today, but we do have to know the answers before we finish the RFP. Because the RFP will need to address what it is that, as an assessment subcommittee, we're looking for in terms of these particular aspects.
Can I ask a question? Are you looking to try to keep it as similar as we have now, or you're
Not
open to a
necessarily.
whole bunch of additional items?
that would be a
Whatever-
policy
whatever you
decision. That would be one of those big ideas, a value statement of
That's right.
how much different do you want it to be and how much similar. So, and maybe we'll just go, there's a slide on this later, but it was hinted on the table of contents as Michelle just alluded to. We don't need the questions today, and part of that is that we're going to recommend that we put a little more, that we push back the timeline just a little bit before we release the RFP formally, and that's because we need some clarity around these questions, and that would allow the board and subcommittee to hear from the RFI vendors, get the data back from the survey, hear from our expert consultants. As you all saw in one of the weekly updates, I had asked Dr. Briggs to give us some information on several different questions, and we'll get that in July. So our hope is that maybe at the subcommittee meeting following the July 9th meeting, we might be able to get some specificity around these issues.
So for today, and we're gonna get an electronic copy of these, we don't really need to have dialogue about these today. We just need to know, these
We
are
just
things
wanna
we're gonna
share them
have to,
with you.
we're
Right.
going to have to deal with.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think we're hoping to have dialogue to the extent that maybe we can provide information as folks reflect and think about it following the meeting. But it's not necessary, and we certainly don't need decisions
Yet.
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 We do need decisions eventually. So one of the first questions is obviously grade span. Which grades do we want to have state mandated assessment? Michelle Walker has provided a lot of great information, and we attached it, and it's embedded into the RFI for what Indiana currently, what assessments are required and which assessments are optional. The RFI was drafted very broadly, as you know, so we could hear from vendors who are proposing filling any of those needs. So, which grades do we, as a policy matter, think that it's appropriate to have state mandated testing for? And you could have potentially, when I say state mandated again, mandated simply means requirement. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to feed into accountability or how it would feed into accountability. So, what's the earliest grade that you want to start? It can't be later than 3rd grade. And what is the high end where you want to end it? We've been having conversations with the accountability panel, but I can speak on behalf of the board staff that we are recommending that we have vertical alignment in the sense of year by year, including at least grades 9 and 10, so that we can have the growth data for high school. Right now, as you know, the high school model does not include a growth component. And you could go up to 11, or as I mentioned here, there's some other options that have been discussed. Perhaps you would have the aligned assessment through grade 10, and then at grade 11, offer a suite of optional assessments for measuring college and career readiness. And that would feed into accountability differently, obviously, because of the optional piece. So what I would recommend would be that would be a participation-based accountability. So now what those assessments would be, has some flexibility, but loosely talking, we were talking about the traditional college entrance exams of ACT, SAT, AccuPlacer as well, basic entrance exam, using for placement at our two-year
Colleges and
colleges. Thank you.
Or Indiana could build their, you might
you could
decide
build
that
your own.
that you think we should build our own.
And then, we also have to think about career readiness indicators.
Right.
Now that, again, no judgment on which particular assessments, but perhaps a work keys or other things like that. Now that leads into the next conversation of which or how many does the state pay for? But these are sorts of things, these are the policy decisions that we need so that we can start drafting an RFP that would meet the needs.
And I know we've had it before, but if we could even get a list again of what the state requires, what the
Sure.
federal government requires. I mean, there are, things like 2 years of social studies, 2 years of science. Because I'm assuming we could even do away with every other year, just, what is it, 5th through 7th with the science, social studies. Maybe we
Right.
want to put 2 years of science back to back, or,
Yeah, there's grade
is everything
spans.
open?
Yeah,
Like,
there's yes, it
everything's
is.
on the table,
It
right?
is, it
But it
is.
would also be nice to know the budget when we look at some of that, because it's, carte blanche is not really the answer either. So,
Sure.
if we could just have some of
got
that,
that
because
right.
it will drive some of the decisions.
And we did receive questions in response to
You
the
are so
RFI, such as, is Indiana interested in growth for social studies? And our responses have been, we are open to hearing proposals, because as you said, really everything is on the table. Indiana is redoing assessments and standards.
Well, and we say that, but we found out today everything's not on the table, really. But
Yep.
so it would be nice to know very specifically what we have to
Yeah.
do.
And
And
those
I
are,
know you've
they're
done
on
it
here.
before.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I can send this again.
If you could send
But
it
it
again.
says, like, for example, science, you have to do one grade in each band of 3, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12.
Yeah, so if
And
we
so
could get
on.
that again, but
Sure.
even some like monetary ties to some of that, or how much are we willing, you know, does it make sense for us to give up some things because it would save some money to use for other things? If we want a reading assessment for everybody, could we save some money somewhere else? I mean, because the money has to come from somewhere.
Well, what we certainly could do is talk to you what our current budget is. So, and then we have a fiscal analysis
Right.
of what they thought the new one was going to cost.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have some basic information that we can be working with. Mhm.
So, any additional? Oh,
Mine's more for Superintendent Ritz. Do you have a thought on how you foresee the policy decisions being made? I mean, are we gonna try and make them here? Are we gonna recommend them to the full board? I mean, how will that happen? What's that look like?
The roundtable meets next week, and that's
Yeah.
one of the things that they have to, because it's statutorily, things go to the roundtable first, and then to the State Board of Education. So all of this is happening in concert. We're trying to coordinate as closely as possible.
And that's what I was going to say, that recommendations come from the department, they go to the roundtable, and then they come to you. We're using this process to inform all of that, so that we can all be in sync already. So that's kind of how it works.
To you as a full board, I think I would just add.
Yes,
When you
yes,
mentioned that.
yes.
What's the weigh-in on these then today?
It'd be good to get your input.
I'm sorry?
How do you want to do it? Because I'm assuming you want our input today then, right? Because
Regarding,
Well, when does the
regarding
roundtable
what?
meet
I
after
did-
next
I didn't hear
week?
you.
'Cause we won't
I'm
know all these
confused.
answers by
Um,
next week.
Are you talking about the
There isn't
waiver?
another scheduled meeting. I think it depends a lot on all these moving parts.
Mhm.
I thought I understood the presentation to be that you wanted our input on policy decisions. But I'm understanding that the process is actually the department recommends to the roundtable, that recommends to the full board. So,
Correct.
and since they're meeting next week, do you want us to give you our 2 cents today
We're-
individually
we're-
as a group?
If you
But
have
we're not
anything,
meeting next
but-
week on these items at the roundtable.
That was my understanding because of the presentation the next day was to start the conversation, not get final policy decisions, but similarly teeing up the discussion, right? I'm looking to the,
What- Yeah, but we're not bringing anything to the roundtable on June 11th.
no, but it's to start the conversation because there is so much complexity and so many interrelated moving parts.
Yeah, we do need to talk about yes, we need to have conversation, we need to talk about what it all is. You are right about that, kind of like we're doing right now.
Exactly.
But we don't have to be informing or having any decisions made on this for June 11th.
That's correct.
Okay, good.
The-
I was going to say,
These two
I
need
didn't
to
think that was
know-
our timeline.
These two need to know before the RFP can be written.
Right.
So that's going to have to be no later
Yes.
than July.
So we have a procurement timeline, so, and you had mentioned we might want to adjust it a little
Yes.
bit. And so that's the timeline that we've been working off of.
I'm lost.
And so Claire, we will share the procurement timeline. I
Okay.
mean, they have to know, here's the process and here's about when we're going to be bringing it to the roundtable and,
I'm going to be bold and just tell you, I vote for the board staff recommendation at the bottom of the page on this one. I don't know if we're doing that or how you're keeping track, but that's where I'm at, 3 through 10 with the option on 11.
So one of the challenges, of course, is, and we're going to get to, I guess it's the next slide, coincidentally, but you want to provide, we obviously have our federal accountability provisions and we have our state requirements. And there's the need to be providing meaningful information and assessment to our students about their college and their career readiness. And in reality, we have yet to see it granted, we are going to hear the RFI presentations next week, but typically those are different assessment types, and that's one of the reasons for the staff recommendation for grade 11 in terms of options, so that students are able to take an assessment that meets their needs and provides them with the information that they need. So here is the next piece. So we talked about grade span, and that sort of ties into this, which is What year in that grade span do you use for our graduation qualifying exam? And that has changed. We haven't always used ECAs, but right now what we're using are the end-of-course assessments, including Algebra 1 and English 10. You're probably familiar. We also have the Biology 1 ECA, but that doesn't, that's not a GQE. So,
It is an NCLB required. Sorry. Sorry. Just to clarify.
Yes. So one of the questions is that we will eventually need information around, because we'll put this in the RFP and vendors will need to be making certain commitments in terms of for you, because of the potential use of the assessment. So they will want to know if we're using an assessment or a particular grade to serve as the graduation qualifying exam. They need to know that on the front end. So we're hoping to have conversation around what year. The staff recommendation is to use the GQE at grade 10 for this purpose. And then again, for college and career readiness, grade 11. And I'm going to use language from Molly Chamberlain, because originally people had, we'd heard, well, how can you use a graduation qualifier at grade 10? And she had talked about it in terms of, it's sort of like qualifying for the Indy 500, but it doesn't mean that you're going to win. It doesn't even mean that you're going to finish the race, but it's saying that you have qualified, you've mastered those essential skills to indicate that you're ready to move on to the next stages.
Mm-hmm.
So those are our recommendations, but obviously we want to just get the conversation started about what the board's pleasure is on it.
And I think too, keeping
Would
in
that
mind.
move away from ECAs then?
Yes.
They would go away.
Yes,
Could-
they would
it
go
could,
away.
Certainly.
It could, or we could maintain them, but
Right.
Hmm.
It's pretty open-ended.
No, it would
One
go
or
With
away.
the
the other,
exception of
one
the
or the
grade
other.
span, I think.
They would go away.
And Michelle mentioned this, but keeping in mind that you do need to have an English and a math assessment in the grade span 10 to 12,
Right.
as well as science. And so that's why we've actually used.
Right.
I know.
So do you remember the old GQE?
Yes,
Do you remember the first edition GQE?
yes.
Okay. Well, anyway, when we had a GQE that was not ECAs, you'll remember it was a domain-based assessment. It was all content up through the end of grade 9, and we gave it at the very beginning of the 10th grade year.
Yeah.
So ECAs have also been our 10th grade measurement when we think about cohorts and so on for accountability. But it could be 11th, it could be 12th. But again, it is a qualifying exam, not a final or what we expect students to know and be able to do to be college and career ready by the end. It is a qualifier, so.
But even that has all sorts of ramifications, because if you take Algebra 1 as an eighth grader.
What was your question?
I'm just thinking through all the ramifications, though. If you take it in grade 10 and you took algebra as an eighth grader, there's a gap in time there. You've taken geometry
In
and
your
other things,
math.
but also,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
but
there
you ought
would
to
be.
still be able to do it, but do you lose some of the rigor of the test because it's less focused on just algebra? I mean, I'm just thinking out loud.
Sure.
I was.
And they're not,
And
and they're not
something I might-
necessarily focused on algebra. The math is
Yeah, it
more
might
of
be
a,
more
is more,
domain-based.
right, it's really more of a
A broader domain test.
a competency exam on mathematics, much broader than algebra.
And we may have talked about this already as a subcommittee, but we would grandfather some students into the current graduation tests. Some students in the pipeline already know that their graduation qualifying exam is Algebra 1 and English 10, and we would let them finish that out, and we would decide
Phase.
what graduating
phase.
class would actually be
Right.
under the new. And that's another piece we actually need to add to our list.
yes, I mean, and some of you are probably familiar with, but we just made the change to using the ECAs as the GQE
2009.
in 2009. So the students who were in the GQE pipeline, if you will, continued to be, we had what we called the all but GQE students, where we continued to offer the GQE re-attempts.
A suggestion that might help is if they have to take both,
Have to
and
take
they,
both.
and if they pass one or the
Mhm.
other, that it would work.
And we used that when we,
Right, to have
before,
the
so that's a
Because-
perfect, that's a great idea, Troy,
Because I really feel like
Yeah.
at some point, that transition's gonna be a nightmare in administration, but if you had an option, you might be able to get somebody through a little bit quicker than having to do.
When we changed to ECAs, students who had passed the ECA but hadn't passed the GQE yet, we said, you've met a higher standard, you're done with that requirement.
Correct.
So, right.
So another big question around assessment will be, as you know, we have both our accountability assessment for grade 3, and we also have the iRead 3. That's and I tried to provide some information around why that has been separate. Oh,
I'm sorry.
Information around how the birth of iRead 3, what that started with, and so while the iStep Plus does provide items around reading, we didn't have sufficient items in iStep to provide a reading-specific score that would be valid and reliable. And as Michelle has described before, how we involve educators, obviously, with our standard setting process, there was not interest to add the necessary duration to iStep to embed those additional reading-specific items, and that was sort of how we wound up with iRead. So rather than extend iStep to include the additional items, because you have to have a certain in size to have a reliable score, we created the separate assessment that would be given at a different time. And I can let Wanel talk about specifically in term for iRead, how many items we're talking about.
Sure.
But go ahead.
But we
Yeah,
actually, through accountability, we talked about having separate information on reading.
We could.
So I think it's that
So
goal.
for example, and as Michelle's already indicated, when we met with the teachers in the summer of 2009 and asked them if they felt like we could actually draw a reading score from iStep, they didn't feel comfortable because of the limited number of items. So there would be some items already on iStep. So moving forward, for example, we could add more reading items and make it robust enough, or we could keep it separate. For example, iRead 3 has 40 items. So there are 12 items for vocabulary, 14 items for literary text, and 14 items for informational or nonfiction text. There are 6 passages on the test. So it just gives you some idea that we would need, if we combined iRead 3 and iStep, for example, we wouldn't need 40 more items, but we would need a considerable number more. But we have a variety of ways that we can resolve that.
I don't know how long does it take to administer iRead 3?
About
Currently.
72 minutes.
72 minutes?
72 to 80, depending on how quickly or how slowly a teacher reads the instructions.
And as long as there's reading data, is there anything legislatively that we have to have? I mean, is it required to have it as a separate test, or as long as we in result have reading data, is there any requirement of us?
No, there's not a separate test. We, under the administrative regulation, what we do now, you all know, is we have the spring iRead window. If students don't pass the first time, they're required to receive intervention from the school, and then they take it a second time in the summer. So there'd have to be conversation around how we pull those items out for the retest opportunity.
But that's in rule.
Again, that's an administrative
yeah, that's-
regulation, but it,
Right.
we don't have the authority to, we would have to modify the rule.
Correct.
So at this point, that's the rule, and so if we absorbed this into the traditional accountability assessment, there would be a need to either have a way to pull them out for a retest opportunity, or we would have to modify the rule because the board, no board has the authority to kind of waive its own rules. There's an attorney general opinion to that effect. So for the kind of the various reasons we've discussed, in terms of the additional duration and just the format of how it works now, the recommendation from the board staff specifically is to maintain iRead as a separate test and allow there to be a separate accountability assessment that would go for
And-
federal accountability.
And I would tell you that from my perspective, that would not be our recommendation. That we would like to embed it, and we would like to see reading data every year so that we really know where children are performing in reading. So however that might happen, I know Carrie's mentioned, that we don't have, we could look at a simpler reading assessment piece that we might even give separately at each grade level that would not encompass the amount, what you're talking about. But we have options with reading. And I just think it's imperative that we get this right and have reading data that follows the child throughout their entire work in school because of the mobility of the children alone. We have to have reading data at a state level. We should be able to pull up a child and say, here it is, and begin instruction.
Well, I was looking at data on where Indiana ranked on reading at like a 4th grade level, and we were high. And then in 8th grade, we dropped a little, and by 10th grade, we dropped even more. And I just think, why would we not focus on that if possible? And I hate to say we want more testing, or let's add more to it, or more at different grade levels, but I just think, reading.
And I
data
don't
is-
want to add more time.
The math is the other way.
Math is the other way. And the reason, and I can tell you, I know that elementary's focus on reading, and they have done an excellent job of it, and the results are in the iRead 3, and the results are going to carry on to the high schools when those reading skills have improved, because they're not leaving any child behind. And they're making sure that all of them are in that category, because this is exciting for me next year. I got my first class that has had iRead 3. So I'm eager to see when they come in as 7th grade, how many reading modifications I have to make with that group. Because before, they weren't held accountable, and thus, they just are allowed to trickle.
Well, that's a whole separate question, because I'm for keeping the accountability piece.
But I just know that's why when you keep it
I
separate,
agree.
it's easier to maintain that accountability at grade 3, especially with the way it's set up in rule right now. But I'm eager to see where it's going to go, because if 3 years from now, those kids' reading scores have improved, but the math scores are reversed. If you really look at it, as they get older, the scores grow.
Well, I couldn't agree more. We have to keep that accountability at grade 3. We should keep the accountability piece. It's just, how do we want to look at the data, and how do we want to collect the
I
data?
don't have a problem following data all the way across.
Yeah.
Because if data's not driving your curriculum, you're not going to go very far.
Okay.
Good conversation.
Your procurement schedule.
Oh, and if I could just quickly, there's one other bullet on here, which is just a sort of, I don't know if I want to, a related topic of conversation, just as you know, we're not just redoing assessments, we're also rethinking accountability in Indiana. And one of the questions, and I know the A to F panel, and this would hinge on how you incorporate your reading measurement, but do you, if iRead 3 is maintained separately, do you build that into the accountability assessment? Because right now, or the accountability metric, because right now it is not. So we already sort of foreshadowed this, but we are requesting that we push back the release of the RFP until late July. And as I mentioned, this allows for a few things. We'll get to hear from and maybe I should again mention, the original procurement timeline had us releasing the RFP at the end of June. So this group would have needed to convene again and answer these questions. But if we push it back to July, then it gives a little more time to, again, we'll hear from the RFI respondents. We will have information back from the assessment survey, and then also be able to hear from Derek Briggs, the expert consultant, and likely Damien as well, that have been in terms of the growth piece. So our thought is by expanding some of the time, we could have more informed decisions so that we can draft a appropriately narrow, tailored RFP, if that's acceptable.
What about the one that's due next March? is that gonna be already in place? We're not gonna be talking about that during
The
this
assessment?
process? Yes.
That's the one that we're already building, the timeline I just went
Yeah.
through, so
Yeah.
it's
We're
already in
already
progress.
doing that. That'll be
Yeah.
done.
So that
These are
one's
for
done.
15,
This is for
16?
15, 16.
Correct,
I just wanted to clarify.
correct.
There was conversation, I think at the last subcommittee, they're kind of blending for me, so I apologize, but at one of the subcommittee meetings on whether the new vendor would have any ability to provide exposure opportunity in spring 15 of what those items would look like. So that could be a question to the RFI or in the RFP for them to address, whether they could at least provide an exposure opportunity. Again, the item types will be similar because of the federal requirement, that the rigor is not going to
Interrupt, yeah.
change.
Whatever that
even
word
if we
is,
change vendor.
Interoperability.
interoperability.
So that's not going to change.
It's a vocabulary word.
Even if we change vendors, but I know there was some conversation around that, but all of these are the sorts of policy decisions that we need guidance on before we draft the RFP.
Thank you. So we have our next meeting June 12th.
I need to weigh in on the timeline.
I'm thinking. I'm worried about the timeline, but I understand it. But I'm concerned about it. I'm concerned more about what happens once we get into the procurement phase. And it's unclear to me because I haven't looked at the legislation to see if that, who handles that and how that handles and how that plays out. But I'm worried about the timeline getting bogged down.
We agree. There's a reason that we started the timeline as aggressively as we did, but we were hesitant, and just as we're moving forward, and it's already June, and we still need to hear from the vendors. We have these major policy decisions that haven't yet been made. We would like to hear back from the survey, and again, the opportunity to hear from Derek Briggs on some of these matters. We thought that that would all be helpful. And it could be, again, we have the July 9th meeting already scheduled, and it could fall on the backs of staff to just, rather than end of July, more like mid-July, and we just make sure that we focus and get that turned around. And we're looking more at like July 15th rather than July 30th. That would be possible.
But we're already being called in for a special meeting at the end of June. So is that, if we settle it there, does that not move us along any faster, or?
So rather than making, sorry, just to make sure I'm understanding. So there's, the board is going to have a special business meeting at the end of June. So are you saying that then the subcommittee would meet after that?
We could.
I'm just trying to figure out how to get an RFP at the door sooner, because getting the RFP out is the easy part. Then you go through this procurement phase. There could be challenges to the bids. There could be a resolution of all those bids. Then you still got to get a bunch of teachers to come in and work with you to construct the test. And we still we have to give a test now. That's what we heard today. So I'm just, that timeline in my mind, my experience tells me, the more you push this out, we're gonna make something very tense down the road.
Well, and if I can just remind that this doesn't affect the test for 14-15.
At all.
At all. That's going to be CTV, and
That's
they're
true.
already working on
Right.
building
That's-
that.
Yeah.
Right, that's what he
Yeah.
just asked.
Yes.
So we don't have to be in any hurry for that.
Does that make sense?
So
It
I mean,
does.
originally, we did ask. I mean, when we first met, like at the first meeting in April or whatever,
was.
we said,
Right.
could we speed this along? But I think we're past that. I think with the waiver and things. it's not
I
possible.
think in terms, we need to use given the US DOE guidance, we need to operationalize the Indiana College and Career
Right.
Readiness Transition Assessment. And it's quite a mouthful. And there's still the possibility that we could talk to vendors on providing an exposure opportunity in the spring of 15. Again, the item types would be
Yeah, they're
the
not gonna
same
change.
in terms of rigor, which is the big piece. That's what's going on here in terms of concern of providing exposure opportunity at the front end of 14-15. That's not going to change with a different vendor, but if there, I remember hearing conversation that there was concern that just knowing that if we change vendors, that that would create some level of angst on the part of our school faculty. If a short exposure opportunity, however that would look, was provided, we can talk to vendors about it.
I wonder too if we could maybe get Dr. Briggs, say, like on the 9th of July, and then shortly thereafter, we could release the RFP perhaps.
Right, so, and that's what I would,
Is that a possibility, maybe, Clear?
June 23rd might
You
be a
said
little
July
too quick to
15th,
get
right?
that information.
yes. So, I think that, again, if Derek presents on the 9th, and then the subcommittee meets, and we get some clarity around the policy
Try to
decisions,
finalize the decisions.
then Michelle and I could just commit to, and other, and involve staff to make sure that we're able to turn that
Because-
around in 5 days.
And because we're having a June meeting, I don't really anticipate a lot of items on July. So this committee would have a lot more time to actually do things.
And I think too, maybe department and board staffs could talk about the best way to get these issues really fully explored. Because that's a lot riding on your shoulders, I know. And I think we want to make sure, we're going to get all of these other inputs, but are there any other groups we're missing? And I think maybe, we can talk about that as,
Sure.
as the two teams.
So I think it's just important to clarify that the 14-15 assessment was never going to be from the new vendor. We were
Correct.
trying to get the
Correct.
exposure,
Mhm.
and that's still going to be a possibility. This is really a 15-16
Right.
assessment.
Right.
Sorry, I knew that.
Yeah.
It's just late in the day.
But there has been conversation
agree.
around whether we can provide some sort of exposure opportunity with the new vendor in spring 15. And there's been, and we've been saying that really the rigor would be the same, but we could understand if there would be anxiety about whether it would feel differently with the new
And depending
vendor.
too on what model, like, let's say that this group decides that there should be 3 tests, a fall, a mid-year, and spring is the summative, then there would already be 2 other experiences during that next school year, and you might decide you
Correct.
don't want or need an
Right.
exposure.
Yeah.
So there's so many unknowns right now, it's really hard for us to pinpoint, but we want to get your best thinking on it so we know what decisions you'd like to make.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have you decided which one of these yet?
We are going to get with those who had not yet responded, and we'll get right back out to you. I'll get Laura on that right away, and we'll get out which dates is going to be the June meeting. Okay. Thank you very much.
Are we adjourned?
We are.